Hi, this is Paul, and I'm continuing my series on C.S. Lewis miracles, and we're up to chapter 3. And in my previous videos, I talked about the subtraction story, and so then I always look for examples of who is telling the subtraction story in um, a very popular way, and I think Sam Harris does it quite succinctly and quite well in this video. Religions are failed sciences, and so let's jump into the video. And he will, I think, pretty clearly articulate what this subtraction story is, if the program will open. Here we go.
I view religions as essentially failed sciences. I mean, religion was the discourse that we had when all causes in the universe were opaque. We didn't know the basis of anything. We didn't know why we were here. We didn't know how diseases spread or what disease was. We didn't know why people died early and why others flourished. We don't know what's causing thunderstorms or causing crops to fail. And we very naturally, as a cognitive and behavioral imperative, we form descriptions of the world and we try to figure out what's going on. We tell ourselves stories about our origins and about where we're going and about causes in the world. And those stories, given our just pervasive ignorance and our disposition to see agency in the world, to see, to feel ourselves in relationship to the world, these stories entail being in relation to invisible friends, and enemies. And we have, this parent figure in the sky who's going to take care of things if you live rightly, and we have other demonic presences that we should be really worried about. And gradually, what you see happening is that religion, as rationality and dozens of specific sciences were birthed in the human conversation, you see religion on 100 fronts losing the argument with science. I mean, we see that on the front of human health and disease, religion, it used to be that you could get a diagnosis of demonic possession. I mean, that was a reasonable thing to believe you had if you were having seizures, say. But now we have a science of neurology and we know about epilepsy. And so when your kid has seizures, you don't go to the church to get him diagnosed and treated by exorcism. And so that's a good thing. I'm saying that religion is losing the argument on every other front. It's losing the argument ethically. It will lose the argument spiritually. I mean, we will understand spiritual experience so well at some point, at the level of the brain and at the level of the way in which using attention in certain ways can change human experience. We'll understand it in a way that makes a mockery of this kind of denominational religion talk about Jesus and grace, or about Buddha and magic powers, and that will break down in the same way that it has broken down on medicine, in medicine, and that's a process I think we just have to be honest about and let unfold.
Okay, I think that's a really excellent articulation of, again, what I call the subtraction story. Now, this is jumping into C.S. Lewis describes it in his book, The Weight of Glory, in his essay, Is Theology Poetry? For all these reasons, then, I think, though we knew even before Freud that the heart is deceitful, that those who accept theology are not necessarily being guided by taste rather than reason. The picture so often painted of Christians huddling together on an ever-narrow strip of beach while the incoming tide of science mounts higher and higher corresponds to nothing in my own experience. Again, this is C.S. Lewis talking, because Sam Harris's position here is not a new position. This was the prevailing position, especially towards the end of the 19th century. Towards the end of the 19th century, what Sam Harris just articulated was very much believed, and it was embraced and asserted, and this was why the First World War took everyone as such a surprise and put Western Europe in such a funk. Now, World War I also, if you look at Phillips Jenkins' book on the Great and Holy War, World War I was also a very religious war. But the aspect here is that for this particular segment of society, everyone believed at the end of the 19th century what Sam Harris just said, and everyone believed that what would happen was that religion would continue to recede, and as C.S. Lewis always seems to be able to put things better than anyone else, painted Christians huddling together on an ever narrower strip of beach while the incoming tide of science mounts higher and higher corresponds to nothing in my own experience, C.S. Lewis says, him being a veteran of the First World War. That grand myth, in order, he's talking about the subtraction story. He's talking about what Sam Harris just articulated in that video. That grand myth, which I asked you to admire a few minutes ago, and it should be admired. It is a powerful, potent myth. Now, I'm distinguishing between the myth of science and the practice of science and the reality of science, and we're going to get deeper into that as we go through here. That grand myth which I asked you to admire a few minutes ago is not for me a hostile novelty breaking in on my traditional beliefs. On the contrary, that cosmology is what I started from. C.S. Lewis, as a boy, in fact, rejected Christianity and was tutored by an ardent post-Christian atheist who was extremely rational, and C.S. Lewis steeped himself in being anti-religious and against God and being hyper-rational, and it's in that context that he studied philosophy. Deeply distrustful and deepening distrust and final abandonment of it long preceded my conversion to Christianity. In other words, before he could become a Christian, he had to give up on this myth of the subtraction story, of, it's sometimes called different things, scientism. In C.S. Lewis's book on miracles, we call it naturalism. We'll also call it materialism. Long before I believed theology to be true, I had already decided that the popular scientific picture, at any rate, was false. One absolutely central inconsistency ruins it. It is the one we touched on a fortnight ago. The whole picture possesses a dependence on inferences from observed facts. Unless inference is valid, the whole picture disappears. And in my previous two videos where I talked about the rationality rules and talked about Jordan Peterson and his need for at least God in scare quotes, this was what I highlighted, is this dependence upon inference. And if you cannot validate or somehow demonstrate inference, if inference is suspect, or if the foundation for inference is suspect, your entire edifice of this particular picture collapses. And so you have this subtraction story. Ancient peoples made up stories to explain the world. Now, we should take a pause here, take a step back and say that Sam Harris just told us a story that explained the world. That's why we call it a subtraction story. And the subtraction story is, just as much as any of our other stories, a made-up story to explain the world. And if you get into Jonathan Haidt's The Elephant and the Rider, you'll understand that, well, the elephant believes what it believes, and the rider kind of makes up stories as it goes along. Is this the picture of our brain? Is this the picture of rationality? Is this realism that we're talking about? Human beings make science meaningful through story. We can't appropriate the meaning of science in any other way. And notice that again. If you listen to Sam Harris or Dennett or Richard Dawkins or a number of other atheists, and we're going to name a bunch of them as we go through this video, you always have to coach it in a story. Well, why? Well, I'm a preacher, and I tell a lot of stories as a preacher. Why? Because that is, in a sense, the native language of phenomenological beings. You cannot communicate to human beings in a memorable way without telling it in a story. And this, of course, gets into some of Jordan Peterson's points about mythology and story. The ancients were not stupid. They knew, in fact, what they were doing. Now, it comes to... No, Harris says, well, they had stories to explain the world. Yes, well, we use stories to explain the world. But one of the things that I want to push back on a little bit is this idea that, well, there's big scary things out there, so they made stories. They personified everything. Well, they certainly did. And if you look at Egyptian mythology, you have gods all over the place. But let's take a look at, for example, the ancient Near East cosmology. I would argue that this cosmology, as in fact Jordan Peterson runs through this once, at least in one of his lectures, if I recall, this was not an unreasonable, irrational cosmology for someone to posit. If they're, for example, living somewhere in the Levant, in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in Judea, why is there water above? Well, there has to be water above because we know that water falls from the sky. So it makes perfect sense that there's perhaps a dome above, and that dome has gates, and so therefore when the god or something opens that gates, waters come down, and the earth is watered, and we live. Well, why do we think there's waters below? Well, if you dig far enough, usually you hit water. And also, why do we think that there are waters to the east? Well, if you're living somewhere in this area and you travel west, 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 you go through these gates, seems like pillars of the earth, and what do you get out here? You get the Great Sea. Now that seems to be the end of the earth. Now if you travel in just about any other direction, what you do is you'll travel far enough, and even if you go through Babylon and then across what today is Afghanistan and take the Silk Route all the way to China, you get to the end of China, and again, you hit water. It is not an unreasonable thing to imagine that if you're standing there and you're a human being, there's waters above, there's waters below. It's not unreasonable to imagine that what the cosmos is in fact this enormous watery domain, and here we live in a little bubble within it, and that bubble is, as Genesis 1 refers to, a firmament, and this is how the world works. Now, in a sense, we're back, and we're going to talk about the elephant and the blind men quite a bit. We're back, in a sense, looking at the elephant, and why are those strange men feeling up this poor elephant? And they're all saying, well, the elephant is this and the elephant is that. But again, my point is, to tell this story, we position ourselves in what I call a monarchical vision. That there is one vision for how this story is seen. And notice, in fact, with this representation, the camera or the artist or the sketcher stands with respect to a number of things to create this representation. All of that is in the picture, but most of this we don't actually see or consider when we tell the story. When we say 7 blind men were touching something and they all had different descriptions, you would say, well, what are they touching? And you would say, well, I don't know what they're touching. But you say 7 blind men are touching an elephant, boom. You have the monarchical vision of an elephant, and suddenly the story makes sense. And this story is, in fact, it's more commonly used to talk about religious pluralism, but it is, in a sense, also a story about science, because science is, as we're describing right now, is based on observation, and in a sense, the scientific story that we come to the world with, usually in order to implement via technology, is a monarchical story, that we have framed the story, and it's from a certain perspective. But just like with the elephant and the blind man, when we look through this picture, we imagine we see everything, when actually, as Jordan Peterson has made, the point Jordan Peterson and many others have made actually, this picture is an extremely careful selection of a situation, just like this particular is an extremely careful selection of a situation. And now we have these particular individuals in certain dress. We have them looking old. They're all male, and in fact, there's something with a dome way in back. In fact, there are many things that we can draw from this picture beyond the main focus, which is the elephant and the blind men. And this is why, in fact, we say a picture is worth 1,000 words. So the story works because of the monarchical vision we all have of the situation. But that is implicit to the story, not explicit. And this is a point made quite persuasively by a man who was an Anglican missionary to India. In his retirement, returned to England and wrote some of the most important books that I think we've seen in the last 100 years in terms of Christian missiology. His name was Leslie Newbigin. His books are very much worth reading. Now, when Charles Taylor, a Canadian philosopher, writes a number of very large books that he writes, the man can't seem to write briefly, he says, why did things change so drastically from 1500 to 2000? Now, Sam Harris might say, well, we discovered science, and science has been pushing back religion, and therefore life is better. Now, in my vlog last Thursday, I noted Andrew Sullivan's piece last week, where he had Pinker and Deanan, a Roman Catholic, I believe, and saying, well, life is getting so much better. Well, life is getting so much better in some ways, but what if everyone is healthy and has as much amusements as possible and has lots of money and, in fact, is absolutely everything, but they're nihilistic? It's very interesting when you look at kind of the origin story of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. Notice that story sometime and how those pieces work together. Anyway, Charles Taylor writes a very long story because he says, this subtraction story is a very, very low resolution picture. And just like the elephant and the blind men, it's a very selective picture of this process. In fact, the picture is far longer and really far more interesting than this very low resolution snapshot that Sam Harris is arguing for with his subtraction story. Whether or not you believe his telling, what you should gather from the subtraction story is that the subtraction story is a myth, and I would assert in both senses of the word. The subtraction story is a myth that I find commonly believed amongst many of my atheist friends. If, they know me, I'm a pastor, I'm a nice guy, and they're my friend. But there's this funny little piece of his life that we can't figure out. Why on earth do you still believe in God? You're so reasonable on many other scores. Again, listen to Richard Dawkins on Unbelievable. I've played that in previous videos. Richard Dawkins is talking to this evangelical pastor and a Jewish scholar, and Richard Dawkins says, well, I'm not arguing against you. You're all reasonable people. I'm arguing against those people who live in places like Nebraska and Kansas who don't want evolution in their textbooks, and they want to teach creation science and so on and so forth. So Sam Harris's story is, in fact, a myth. It's a framing story for the world, and in fact, it's been a very potent myth. And many, many people have found it convincing, and they found it convincing because cell phones work, because if I stop eating so many little Reese's peanut butter cups, I don't gain so much weight, and the doctor is happier with me. Now, what's interesting about the subtraction story is that the subtraction story has a number of sub-stories that seem to validate the subtraction story. And one of the most famous sub-stories that validates the subtraction story is Galileo. And the story goes like this. Galileo used science to tell the truth about the world, while the church used the Bible to spread its myths. And the church was very mean, and they were mean to Galileo. Now, it's worthwhile doing a little bit of research into this story, as it is with the Dayton monkey trial. Many of the times when you track down the sub-stories of the subtraction story, you'll find, as is in almost always the case when you track down any compressed story, that the higher resolution pictures are far more complicated. And one of the key things that is almost always missed in the Galileo story is that, yes, Galileo was using observation and was pushing back against what was church doctrine. But what's really interesting to note was that the church was using Aristotle, not the Bible. The picture of the world that Galileo was critiquing was Aristotle's picture of the world, not the, let's say, a strict reading of Genesis 1's picture of the world. And so you might ask, well, what was the Roman Catholic Church in the Middle Ages doing with Aristotle's picture of the world? And if you ask a question like that, and you do a little bit of research into that question, you will be rewarded by going out and going into the chaos of the library and doing a bit of research. Now, I've been using Philip Carey's Philosophy and Religion in the West, which is an Audible book, part of the Great Courses series, and with these books you get a set of notes, a PDF. You get that via, you can find it on Audible and you can find it in other places. Philip Carey says this: modern philosophy is born in a crisis of authority, especially religious authority. In the wake of the wars of religion after the Protestant Reformation, the authoritative text, which had defined the nature of the medieval world, no longer seemed to give unambiguous answers to fundamental questions about God, the world, and the self. Now, if you go back over some of my previous videos, I walk through the Protestant Reformation, empiricism, rationalism, Nietzsche, and I discussed that in some of my earlier commentaries on Jordan Peterson's biblical lectures. Modern philosophy therefore begins by seeking the sources of belief and certainty in the self. This epistemology, turned to the subject, is illustrated by Descartes' method of systemic doubt and his famous starting point of certainty. I think, therefore I am. It is also a feature of Locke's evidentialist ethic of belief, according to which individuals are obliged to hold no belief, not even religious beliefs, unless they have adequate evidence to support it. Now, what's interesting about this, and in a sense a confirmation about what Peterson talks about in terms of the way stories persist, things that endure throughout time, these two elements, actually a number of elements from Descartes, the turn to the self, the use of doubt to try to find certainty. In other words, we scrape away all the doubtful stuff to get to the foundation of certainty. In other words, doubt in that sense is kind of like a shovel. And then Locke's evidentialism, that, if I say, well, I think my dog is telling me winning lottery numbers, someone would say, prove it. I don't think, number one, your dog can tell you any numbers, and number two, I doubt they'll be winning lottery numbers. So this is an example of Locke's evidentialism. Now, both of these elements, all three of these elements, this turn to the self, this using doubt, as we imagine, to dig away or uncover, to find foundational certainty, even the language of that is a little archetypal and interesting. And then Locke's evidentialism, these have become so self-evident, so axiomatic within our culture, we don't even think about these elements anymore. We just simply assume them. And if we stop and pause, we might ask, well, if we're assuming these things, yet I have never even studied Descartes and Locke, what else might we be assuming? And that's a very good question. So, Philip Carey goes on, modern thought and the crisis of authority. The meaning of authority. In Western religion, the word authority originally refers to the authority of a teacher rather than a king. And isn't it interesting how we, in a sense, have displaced that? It referred to educational, not political authority. In the Middle Ages, it came to refer to authoritative texts of the Western tradition. If you remember way back to some of my videos, you'll remember dealing with John Walton, about how John Walton talked about before there were texts in the ancient Near East, there were authorities. And it's in that sense that the first 5 books of the Bible, when we talk about them being the books of Moses, they in a sense have the authority of Moses. Now, were they written by Moses? Now, the vast majority of contemporary scholars will say no. And even ancient scholars had their doubts at the end of Deuteronomy when Moses records his own death. You think, wow, that's one heck of a prophet. So, the Middle Ages came to refer to authoritative texts of the Western tradition, the authorities whose writings one consulted to learn something. In other words, if you were doing physics at the end of the Middle Ages, you were studying Aristotle. That's where you learned physics. Now, that's very different today than if you go to a physics classroom where, let's say, even in grade school, when you're starting to learn rudimentary physics, you take a look at something and you say, whoop, how fast does that fall? Why does it travel in an arc? We learn physics out here in the world. You'd say, well, of course. Well, and you'd say, of course, because every time you say, of course, it's because, well, this is part of this implicit world that you're living in. Hence the crisis of authority. Also, Aristotle was the key to physics, and the church fathers on the Bible. So when Galileo has this fight with the church, he's fighting Aristotle. And he's fighting Aristotle by using things out there in the world. And as I've said before, you have this crisis of authority with text. Now we're going to know physics not by consulting the authoritative text of Aristotle, but by engaging the world, engaging real things. You know, when I hit my head on Amusing Ourselves to Death, it leaves a mark. These are real things. Gravity, this is how, I can make a little breeze. This is how we learn physics today. Now, sources of the crisis of authority. Religious. In the wake of the Protestant Reformation, Christian Europe could not agree on the meaning of religious authorities. And again, if you look at the Protestant Reformation, one of the things that the church was saying to Martin Luther was, we are the authority, we give the text authority. And Martin Luther is saying, wait a minute, you have it backwards. The authority gives you text. And then, you go back to Jesus talking to the religious leaders of his day, and he says to his disciples, they sit in Moses' seat. Well, what did he mean by that? Well, they have the authority. And so Jesus says, do as they say, but don't do as they do, because they're hypocrites. And we're going to talk about hypocrisy a little bit later in this video. So there's a crisis of religious authority. There's a crisis of scientific authority. Modern Newtonian physics is based on experience and observation rather than on reading authorities. This is what Galileo was doing. This is what Newton was doing. Now, our stories are often low-resolution approximations. Galileo did pitch observation versus Aristotle. Do some reading on Newton and his religious beliefs. Alchemy. Newton is a very interesting figure. And today we just simply associate him with, say, Newtonian mechanics. But what he was doing, and what many of the others were doing, was practicing natural philosophy. And I'm currently reading a history book about that period. And the vast majority of these natural philosophers in England and other places, these fathers who give us physics and chemistry, were poring over the Bible regularly to try to figure out the second coming of Christ. And the bubonic plague was wiping out a fifth of the population of London. All of this is happening at the same time. These are extraordinarily religious people. In fact, these people are so religious, they make probably just about anybody in America, except perhaps the Amish, look secular. The relationship between observation and story, however, is long and complex. Now let's get into C.S. Lewis's chapter 3. He first revisits the conclusion of chapter 2. If naturalism is true, every finite thing or event must be in principle explicable in terms of the total system. This is what Sam Harris was talking about. I said explicable in principle because of course we are not going to demand that naturalists at any given moment should have found the detailed explanation of every phenomenon. And okay, so this is what we're saying. Okay, this is why we're saying that this, in fact, is a system. This is a myth. Naturalists cannot demonstrate, nor would we ask them to demonstrate, the truth of their position by demonstrating every single event that is caused by another event. Absolutely, they could not possibly begin to do that, although their position says that is in fact the case. And this, for C.S. Lewis's, the title of his book says, Why There Can Be No Miracles. Because this is your doctrine. This is your belief system. Everything within the world has a cause within the world, and it's caused by the whole show, the whole system. And so there can be no such things as the virgin birth, as Jesus raising the dead, as the resurrection of Jesus, or as any of the other miracles that you'll find recorded in antiquity or in any other religions. For by naturalism we mean the doctrine that only nature, the whole interlocking system, exists. That's all that exists. Anything beyond that we can't know about. In fact, well, we're getting into the question of whether we can talk about it, because then we're going to get into Peterson stuff. And if that were true, everything, every event would, if we knew enough, be explicable without remainder as a necessary product of the system. The whole system being what it is, it ought to be a contradiction in terms if you're not reading this book at this moment. And conversely, the only cause why you are reading it ought to be that the whole system, the whole show, at such and such a place and hour is bound to make that course. And this is why, in fact, there's no free will. Everything is determined from the moment of the singularity of the Big Bang. Physics and everything has been moving out to necessitate exactly where we are. And all of the ideas that you've had about free will, of preferring Reese's peanut butter cups to, I haven't even touched these things, and yeah, this is a lot better to eat than this. It's all been determined from the Big Bang. There's no such thing as free will. In fact, free will is an illusion. Now you might say, yeah, but nobody believes this. Really? 2013, on my blog, this article caused me to start a page on my blog called Delightful Article of the Month, because when I read this article, I thought, I've got to remember this article. So about 5 years ago in the Weekly Standard, this article came out, and it was entitled The Heretic. Contemporary philosophers have a name for the way you and I see the world, a world filled with other people, with sounds and colors, sights and sensations, things that are good, things that are bad, and that are very good indeed. Ourselves, who are able more or less to make our own way through life by our own lights. Philosophers call this common view the manifest image. Daniel Dennett pointed out at the conference, this was talking about a conference that happened in the Berkshires in late 2012, I believe, pointed out at the conference that modern science, at least since the revelations of Darwin, have been piling up proofs that the manifest image is not really accurate in any scientific sense. Rather, science, this vast interlocking combine of genetics, neuroscience, evolutionary biology, particle physics, tells us that the components of the manifest image are illusory. Color, for example. That azalea outside the window may look red to you, but in reality, it has no color at all. The red comes from certain properties of the azalea that absorb some kinds of light and reflect other kinds of light, which are then received by the eye and transformed by our brain into a subjective experience of red. And sounds too, complex vibrations in the air, are soundless in reality. So if a tree falls in the woods, can anyone hear it? Well, actually, a tree makes no sound. That's a soundless reality. But we have ears to hear. But our ears are able to turn vibrations into a car alarm or a cat's meow or a tree falling in the woods, or worse, the voice of Mariah Carey. Poor Mariah Carey. These capacities of the human organism are evolutionary adaptations. Everything about human beings, by definition, is an evolutionary adaptation. Our sense that the colors and sounds exist out there and not merely in our brain is a convenient illusion that long ago increased the survival chances of our species. And so when we watch Rationality Rules and he talks about making a sound, we have to buy into, well, what exactly are we buying into again? Who's making this statement that all of these things are illusory, that there's this manifest image that I think I see? Powered by Darwin, modern science proceeds in Dennett's phase as a universal corrosive. And this is similar to what Sam Harris was talking about. Destroying illusions all the way up and all the way down. Dismantling our feelings of freedom and separate selfhood, our morals and beliefs, a mother's love and a patient's prayer. In reality, we are all just molecules in motion. The most famous, most succinct, and most pitiless summary of the manifest image fraudulence was written nearly 20 years ago by the geneticist Francis Crick. You, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Who you are is nothing but a pack of neurons. This is, in fact, we are discussing C.S. Lewis's The Whole Show. Now, bear in mind, C.S. Lewis first wrote this in the 40s, updated it in the 50s, but this has been around, actually, for a very long time, and it keeps getting confirmed by science. And so we might ask, what exactly is science pushing back? What is more and more crowded on the edge of the beach? Is it religion? Well, let's figure that out. This view is the naturalism that the workshoppers in the Berkshires were trying to move forward. Naturalism is also called materialism, the view that only matter exists, or reductionism, the view that all life, from tables to daydreams, is ultimately reproducible to pure physics, or determinism, the view that every phenomenon, including our own actions, is determined by a pre-existing cause, and these causes go all the way back, which itself is determined by another cause, and so back onto the Big Bang. The naturalistic project has been greatly aided by neo-Darwinism, the application of Darwin's theory of natural selection to human behavior, including the areas of life once assumed to be non-material, emotions and thoughts, habits and perceptions. At the workshop, the philosophers and scientists each added his own gloss to neo-Darwinian reductive naturalism, or materialistic neo-Darwinian reductionism, or naturalistic materialism, or reductive determinism. They are unanimous in their solid certainty that materialism, as we call it here to limit the number of isms, is the all-purpose explanation for life as we know it. And this is exactly, in fact, what C.S. Lewis notes again in the 40s and 50s. It is clear that everything we know beyond our own immediate sensations is inferred from those sensations. So, in other words, we have this manifest image. And in fact, what science has been demonstrating since C.S. Lewis's time is, in fact, the whole show seems more and more real. We know a lot more about how the brain works and about how we behave. And you know, we're now thinking, well, there's these tiny little microbes in my gut that are really hungry for sugar. So, you know, when I get weak and let them talk to me, I eat Reese's peanut butter cups because I love them. So Lewis continues, I do not mean that we begin as children by regarding our senses as evidence and therefore arguing consciously to the existence of space, matter, and other people. Lewis is in this sense talking about naive realism. I mean that if, after we are old enough to understand the question, our confidence in the existence of anything else, realism out there, say the solar system or the Spanish Armada, is challenged, our argument in defense of it will have to take the form of inferences from our immediate sensations. I believe I am sitting in my office. I believe this is amusing ourselves to death. I'm getting these as inferences from our immediate sensations. Could I have been dreaming? I've had a lot of experience dreaming. I'm pretty doggone sure I'm not dreaming at all, but I'm sitting in my office and I'm making this video. There are inferences from our immediate sensations. Put in its most general form, the inference would run, since I am presented with colors, shapes, pleasures, and pains which I cannot perfectly predict or control, and since the more I investigate them, the more regular these behaviors appear, therefore there must exist something other than myself. I'm not a solipsist. And it must be systematic. This is a realism. There is a real world out there. There is something that exists independent of my desires, independent even of my perceptions. When I go to sleep at night, when I put my cell phone on the charger, I wake up in the morning, it is still on my charger, and if it's not on my charger anymore, I talk to my wife and my kids. Inside the very general inference, all sorts of special trains of inference lead us to more detailed conclusions. We infer evolution from fossils. We infer the existence of our own brains from what we find outside in the skull of other creatures like ourselves in the dissecting room. All possible knowledge, then, depending on the validity of reasoning. If the feeling of certainty, which we express by words like must be and therefore and since, is a real perception of how things outside our minds really must be, well and good. But if the certainty is merely a feeling in our own minds and not a genuine insight into the reality behind them, well, you know, Reese's peanut butter cups are so good, they must be good for me. If it feels so right, it can't be wrong. Isn't that what Debbie Boone taught us? And just about everybody else who sings those songs. If this certainty is merely a feeling in our minds and not a genuine insight into reality behind them, if it merely represents the way our minds happen to work, then we have no knowledge. Unless human reasoning is valid, no science can be true. So I go to my doctor, and my doctor says, no, they're bad for you. And I say, I don't believe you. But then I look around and I do a sample of everyone who eats these 5 times a day and everyone who doesn't and eats vegetables and drinks V8. And I discover all the people eating these are keeling over in their 60s. These other people are living to their 90s, except for the smokers. Hey, I know a little something else. It follows that no account of the universe can be true unless that account leaves it possible for our thinking to have real insight. A theory which explains everything in the whole universe, but which made it impossible to believe that our own thinking is valid would be utterly out of court. For that theory would itself have been reached by thinking, and thinking is not valid. That theory would, of course, be itself demolished. It would have destroyed its own credentials. It would be argument that proved that no argument is sound, a proof that there's no such thing as proofs, which is nonsense. In other words, what we're saying here is that this entire project of science is built on all of this observation and all of this inference and all of this experimentation. And if inference isn't valid, well, what do we have left? This isn't a new idea to C.S. Lewis. Thus, a strict materialism refutes itself for the reason given long ago by Professor Haldane. If my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true, and hence I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms. Now, I'm going to make this argument a number of times, and the reason is because the first time you hear it, it doesn't make any sense. It's like in Luther's words, a cow staring at a new gate. You keep looking at it and looking at it, but if you keep looking at it enough, you begin to realize, because we believe so much of what we see and what we infer. We are, in fact, consumed by this. And we're going to go back to the Berkshire. We're going to go back to the Berkshires in a few minutes. But naturalism, even if it's not purely materialistic, seems to me to involve the same difficulty, though in somewhat less obvious form. It discredits our processes of reasoning, or at least reduces their credit to such a humble level that it can no longer support naturalism itself. Let's look at 3 ideas of knowledge. I feel hungry. My dog gives me winning lottery numbers. I make hydrogen and oxygen gases from water. Now you would say the first, I feel hungry. Yeah, that's true. But that's not thinking, that's not inference, is it? Well, think about it. My dog gives me winning lottery numbers. Well, that just sounds crazy. What if I won the lottery? And in fact, I believe that my dog gave me that lottery number. Well, wouldn't be crazy either. We're going to get to pragmatism. I make hydrogen and oxygen gases from water. And you would say, wow, now we're talking knowledge. Now we've got something there. All right. Is naturalism likely? Everything we've learned from science since the 1940s when C.S. Lewis wrote makes naturalism less likely, because our naive trust in our senses is more complicated. And science itself is telling us this naive experience, this manifest image that we possess is increasingly less likely. That's what Dennett, Dawkins, all of these materialist philosophers, the people that say rationality rules is speaking from. This is, in fact, the temple of naturalism. And everything we've learned in science makes that case less likely. See, the problem with science, we have problems with science because of naturalism. We have the inference problem. If inferences are suspect, science is suspect. We have the truthful observation problem. All thought events, and they are events, and in fact, what neo-Darwinianism is saying is that my thoughts are events just like the evolution of finches. They're all events. They're just chemical events, and they're a little harder to watch and harder to study, but they're events nevertheless. All thought events, including perceptions, are products of natural causes. The whole show. Can they yield truth? Professor Haldane, the early part of the 20th century, says that's circular reasoning. You can't use that. You have the sociology problem. Must naturalists always be philosophical hypocrites and elitists? Back to the story. One notable division did arise among the participants, however. Some of the biologists thought the materialist view of the world should be taught and explained to the wider public in its true high-octane Crickean form. Then common, non-intelligent people might see that purely random universe without purpose or free will or spiritual life of any kind isn't as bad as some superstitious religious people have led them to believe. In other words, religion's bunk, but go ahead and keep imagining you have free will because none of us have it anyway. All right. Daniel Dennett took a different view. While it is true that materialists tell us that a human being is nothing more than a moist robot, a phrase Dennett took from a Dilbert comic, we run a risk when we let this cat or robot out of the bag. If we repeatedly tell folks that their sense of free will or belief in objective morality is essentially an illusion, such knowledge has the potential to undermine civilization itself, Dennett believes. Civil order requires the general acceptance of personal responsibility, which is closely linked to the notion of free will. So all those people from this camp who are yelling at Peterson, well, then maybe they shouldn't yell at him. Maybe you should go out into the masses and say, be the hero. You have free will. Your choices make a difference. You're not just a moist robot. There's meaning in the universe. There's God, maybe. We'll get to Peterson a little bit later. Civil order requires the general acceptance of personal responsibility, which is closely linked to the notion of free will. Better, said Dennett, if the public were told that for general purposes, the self and the free will and objective morality do indeed exist, that colors and sounds exist too, not just in the way they think, they exist in a special way. Which is to say, ultimately, not at all. When everyone's special, says Dash of The Incredibles, no one's special. On this point, the discussion grew testy at times. I was reminded of the debate among British censors over the publication of Lady Chatterley's Lover a half-century ago. Fine for you or me, one prosecutor is said to have remarked, but is this the sort of thing you would leave lying about for the wife and servants to read? There was little else to disturb the materialist in the Berkshire contentment. Surveys have shown that the vast majority of philosophers and scientists call themselves naturalists and materialists. Nearly all popular science books, not only those written by the workshoppers, conclude that materialism offers the true picture of reality. The workshoppers seemed vexed, however, knowing that not everyone in their intellectual class had yet tumbled to the truth of neo-Darwinianism. A video from the workshop showed Dennett complaining that a few, but only a few, contemporary philosophers have stubbornly refused to incorporate the naturalistic conclusions of science into their philosophizing. Get in line, boys and girls. We're all thinking the same. You don't want to be left out. Continuing to play around with outmoded ideas like morality, and sometimes even the soul. You can sympathize, this a little bit later, you can sympathize with Leiter and Weisberg for fudging on materialism as philosophy of everything. As a philosophy of everything, it is an undeniable drag. As a way of life, it gets even worse. Fortunately, materialism is never translated into life as it is lived. As colleagues or friends, husbands and mothers, wives and fathers, sons and daughters, materialists never put their money where their mouth is. Are they elitists? Like the censors of Lady Chatterton of the dishy book? Or are they hypocrites? Nobody thinks his daughter is just molecules in motion and nothing but. Nobody thinks the Holocaust was evil, but only in a relative provisional sense. A materialist who lived his life according to these professed convictions, understanding himself to have no moral agency at all, seeing his friends and enemies and family as genetically determined robots, wouldn't just be a materialist, he'd be a psychopath. Say what you want about Leiter and Weisberg and the workshoppers at the Berkshires, from what I can tell, none of them is a psychopath. Not even close, which leads to the one who must not be named. And you might have wondered early on, why was this article called The Heretic? Because this article talks about Thomas Nagel. Now, I'm trying to recall, but I do not recall Jordan Peterson ever mentioning the name of Thomas Nagel. And if you listen to Sam Harris or Daniel Dennett, you will probably not hear them say the name of Thomas Nagel, even though Thomas Nagel is one of the most brilliant, foremost. He's not a Christian. Okay, so not playing a game here. We can talk about Alvin Plantinga if we want to, but we're going to talk about Thomas Nagel. He doesn't buy the whole thing. He says, I will not bow in the temple of naturalism because it doesn't hold up. You can't be both a scientist and a naturalist. You remember Peterson saying that? in Transliminal 2015? I remember him saying that. This is from Mind and Cosmos, Thomas Nagel's book. Oops, I got it backwards. All right. My skepticism is not based on religious belief or on any belief in any definite alternative. In other words, Thomas Nagel says, I don't have this worked out yet. It is just a belief that the available scientific evidence, in spite of the consensus of scientific opinion, does not in this matter rationally require us to subordinate the incredulity of common sense. In other words, we can't get rid of common sense on this. Our theory has a problem. This is especially true with regard to the origin of life. In other words, this isn't just a pragmatic problem. This problem affects our assumptions about how life began. The world is an astonishing place, and the idea that we have in our possession the basic tools needed to understand it is no more credible now than it was in Aristotle's day. That it has produced you and me and the rest of us is the most astonishing thing about it. If contemporary research into molecular biology leaves open the possibility of legitimate doubts about a fully mechanistic account of the origin and evolution of life dependent only on the laws of chemistry and physics, this can combine with the failure of psychophysical reductionism to suggest that principles of a different kind are also at work in the history of nature. Principles of the growth of order are in their logical form teleological rather than mechanistic. Oh my, this is gonna, now you can see why Nagel is the heretic. Why he was not invited to the little getaway at the Berkshires, even though he is one of the most important philosophers of our time, teaches at NYU. He's not some kook out somewhere, but you'll never hear about him because he who must not be named. Don't say Thomas Nagel. Don't read his book. You will be a heretic. Now, whose system is dying the death of 1,000 cuts? Because actually, after World War I, before World War I, when Sam Harris's view was supposed to sweep religion from the world, I see no reason why we should imagine the world is getting less religious. Now, maybe you live in a little secular bubble, and that seems to be the way it goes. But if you get up high enough and you look at more people of the world looks very religious indeed. Back to C.S. Lewis. But this, it seems to me, is what naturalism is bound to do. It offers what professes a full account of our mental behavior, but this account, on inspection, leaves no room for the act of knowing. We don't really know anything. We're just playing out what started at the Big Bang. Knowing is an illusion. It's the manifest image, free will, love. It's all an illusion. So says the philosophers, the naturalistic philosophers in the Berkshires. And if it's all an illusion, there's no insight. There's no acts of knowing or insight on which the whole value of thinking as a means to truth depends. It is indeed on all hands that reason and even sentience and life itself are latecomers to nature. Now Lewis is saying, if the manifest image of truth, the manifest image is dependent on our brains and on this evolution and on all of this. In other words, it doesn't precede us. It's a product of us. It is agreed on all hands that reason, even sentience, even life itself are latecomers to nature. If there is nothing but nature, therefore, reason must have come into existence by a historical process. And of course, for the naturalist, this process was not designed to produce a mental behavior that can find truth. There is no designer, and indeed, until there were thinkers, there was no truth or falsehood. The type of mental behavior we now call rational thinking or inference must therefore have been evolved by natural selection, by the gradual weeding out of types less fit to survive. Now, this makes rationality rules extremely ironic for his channel. What realism are you talking about? And this is where Jordan Peterson steps in, because Jordan Peterson steps in a sense, saying something, well, where is Peterson and where is Lewis? They have to talk together a little bit, because Peterson, like Thomas Nagel, has doubts. And Peterson is saying, I think he sees, but he doesn't quite put it on the table, this materialistic framework in and of itself, as the naturalists say, can't yield truth. And Peterson is not willing to give up on truth. And this is where we have the drawing that I used back in some of these other videos. You have the naturalists, you have the materialists, and the Newtonians, as Peterson calls them in here. And he says, hey, story governs stuff. We have hierarchies going on. We see tools. This is being. This is knowing. The materialists come back and say, aha! Without a brain, you can't know anything. Well, of course the materialists are going to say that. And now Lewis comes and says, hey, but wait a minute. This entire drawing, me making this video, this is just the outworking of the Big Bang. We have no understanding that this, in fact, is telling us anything truthful. And so, in a sense, this is where the pragmatists come in and say, ah. And so if you listen to Scott Adams, we get the moist robot thing from, Scott Adams will say, oh, we know truth when we can predict. Prediction. Prediction seems to be the key. So the things we can predict, then we know truth. The problem you're going to have is, how good are you at predicting, really? Scott Adams might say, well, I predicted Trump would win. Well, good for you. Let's keep going. You got a lot more predicting to do if you're going to tell us how much you really know. Now, let's get back to our knowledge. I feel hungry. Now, we find this to be uninteresting until the doctor tells us to lose weight and might say something, well, there might be little sugar microbes in your gut that really want you to eat this Reese's peanut butter cup. And which thinking do you want to do? The little microbes in your gut or the one in your head? And so you say, well, which thinking is going on? Because I feel me to want the peanut butter cup. Are these the microbes talking to me? When you say, well, I can resist them. Who's I? And where does that I come from? Well, maybe the watchers, the Jungian cloud of witnesses inside my noggin. My dog gives me winning lottery numbers. I don't have enough time today to go into random. I did that in the video that, anyway. Here's the thing. Prediction. Let's say I win 3 lotteries in a row. And when I get on TV with my big check, they say, how did you win 3 times? My dog tells me. Oh, who's crazy now? This is just it. With random, it doesn't matter if my dog tells me. It doesn't matter if I sit down and I analyze the lottery numbers from the last 50 years. It doesn't matter if I sit there and study that little ping pong ball machine and say, wow, the ones, just the tiny little weight of the 16 on that ball makes it a little lower than the ones with 3s. And so maybe I can find a pattern, and it's random. Well, what is random? Well, we're going to get into Lewis's story, and he says, well, what is nature like? Is it random? I make hydrogen and oxygen gases from water. We call this science because we can demonstrate it. Okay, but how much can we demonstrate this way? Now, I'm not a skeptic. And in fact, I am a realist. But the question is going to be, upon what can we base realism? And I don't think it can be based on naturalism. This is where pragmatism comes in, because pragmatism comes in and says, hey, we can work this out. Maybe we can't know the whole thing. Maybe, who is it, me, or is it the Reese's peanut butter, the bacteria in my gut wanting me to eat that Reese's peanut butter cup? Which one is going on it? Well, close enough. We don't need to know truth with a capital T. We can know truth enough. Now, as I talked with Roland, this isn't advanced philosophy at all, really. And this isn't new philosophy. C.S. Lewis, writing in the 40s, made this point based on philosophers before him. And in fact, as I said, everything we've learned in science makes naturalism and materialism more untenable, more unlikely as an explanation for the whole show. And so then we listen to Jordan Peterson, and as Roland put in his slides, well, what are we talking about? Well, Peterson on truth. It's true enough so that if you act it out or hold it, that increases your chance of survival and reproduction, and over long periods of time, it's true. And truth serves life. I really appreciate Roland putting all this stuff down for us. Truth is expressed in action, and action is made true by its consequences. And you get into Peterson's definition of truth, which Rationality Rules really objected to. Peterson says, hey, we can't know truth out there if we prop up our materialism with pragmatism by saying, as Scott Adams does, I think it's true because we can predict, because I can predict getting hydrogen and oxygen, doing that on, putting electricity through water. Therefore, I have truth. And you say, okay, you got that little truth right there. But can you really prove my dog isn't talking to me if I pick 3 lottery numbers? Because that's pretty unusual. You say, well, that kind of stuff doesn't happen. Well, go back and see who picks lottery numbers and how often they win. This is funny. We get into probability and all of this stuff. So then that's why Peterson comes and says, well, we can't, Peterson's at least honest enough to say the naturalist, materialist stuff, that really doesn't work. So I'm going to confine myself over here in my pragmatism to true enough. And then he's going to say, so what it means that in part that the environment is finally incomprehensible. Is he a skeptic? I don't think he's a skeptic, because you can't predict it. Okay, so what that means is that a limited creature that has established itself by Darwinian means can't have access to the truth. They can only have access to sufficient truth, and sufficient truth is the truth that allows you to survive and reproduce. And from a Darwinian perspective, there isn't any truth past that. And so the conversation I was having this week was Jordan Peterson a Christian? I think let's leave the Christian stuff over to the side. Jordan Peterson is Jordan Peterson. Let's talk about what he really believes. And every time he talks about metaphysics and materiality meeting up, and every time he says, I don't know, it's because of his pragmatic epistemology. That's what holds him back. He's reluctant to say beyond that because Darwinian, and this is why he says, well, is the hydrogen bomb true? Well, if the hydrogen bomb leads to our destruction by Jordan Peterson's definition of truth, it is not true. Just like tiger bombs. Okay. Now, Rationality Rules says, no. It exists out there. And Peterson says, prove it. You've got your manifest image. You've got your inference. You've got all of these mental processes. Your system doesn't work. Well, where does that leave us? Now, you might think, wow, Jordan Peterson, he just really nailed that. This is new. Well, actually, pragmatism's been around since before C.S. Lewis. A still humbler position remains. And so you'll see that Jordan Peterson is more humble than Rationality Rules. You may, if you like, give up all claims of truth, or go down to sufficient truth. You may say simply, our way of thinking is useful, without adding, even under your breath, and therefore true. See, now Jordan Peterson goes at the extra step and says, it's my way of true. It's true in a Darwinian sense, not a Newtonian sense. It enables us to set a bone and build a bridge and make a Sputnik. And that is good enough. The old high pretensions of reason must be given up. You got to give it up. Reason, done. It is behavioral. It is a behavior evolved entirely as an aid to practice. That is why when we use it simply for practice, we get along pretty well. It's true enough. But when we fly off into speculation and try to get general views of reality, we end in the endless, useless, and probably merely verbal disputes of the philosophers. And some might say, well, isn't that where we are right now? We will be humbler in the future. Goodbye to it all. No more theology, no more ontology, no more metaphysics. But then, equally no more naturalism. For of course naturalism is a prime specimen of the towering speculation, discovered from practice and going far beyond experience, which is now being condemned. Nature is not an object that can be presented either to the senses or the imagination. It can be reached only by the most remote inferences, or not reached, merely approached. It is the hoped-for, assumed unification of a single interlocked system of all the things inferred from our scientific experiments. More than that, the naturalist, not content to assert this, goes on to sweeping negative assertions. There is nothing except this, an assertion surely as remote from practice, experience, and any conceivable verification as has ever been made since man began to use reason speculatively. Yet on the present view, the very first step into such a use was an abuse, a perversion of the faculty merely practical, and the source of all chimeras. On these terms, the theist's position must be a chimera, nearly as outrageous as the naturalist. Nearly, not quite. It abstains from the crowning audacity of a huge negative. But the theist need not and does not grant these things. He is not committed to the view that reason is a comparatively recent development molded by a process of selection, which can select only the biologically useful. For him, reason, the reason of God, is older than nature, and from the orderliness of nature, which alone enables us to follow her, is derived. In other words, reason comes before nature. Math comes before physics. Boy, that'll be a fun conversation. To him, the human mind is the act of knowing, is illuminated by divine reason. It is set free in the measure required from the huge nexus of non-rational causation, free from this to be determined by the truth known. And the preliminary processes within nature which led up to this liberation, if there were any, were designed to do so. To call the act knowing, the act not of remembering that something was so in the past, but of seeing. This is what I call the monarchical vision, but of seeing that it must always be so, and in any possible world, to call this act supernatural is some violence to our ordinary linguistic usage. But of course, we do not mean by this that it is spooky, or sensational, or even in any religious sense spiritual. We mean only that it won't fit in, that such an act, to be what it claims to be, and if it is not, all our thinking is discredited, cannot be merely the exhibition of a particular place and time of that total and largely mindless system of events called nature. It must break sufficiently free from that universal chain in order to be determined by what it knows. Now, in other words, the picture of the elephant and the blind men. This is the monarchical vision. Stands outside of time, stands outside of possible worlds. This is this vision of nature that we do when we reason, that is, we do when we do science. Weinstein's argument. What makes the scientific truth hierarchically superior is that it explains all the subordinate truths in a way that is logically consistent. The only problem is, that's a good statement, but it's wrong about science. You can only see science if you can see nature, and you can't see nature from within it. You can't see science in nature unless you have reason and inference. And where are you getting these from? Are they the product of nature? Then you're within it. In other words, if you're within nature, you can't see nature and you can't have science. It's nested. It's hierarchy. And what you have to do is come above it. Naturalism can't afford this. Your brain science can't be afforded. C.S. Lewis is theology poetry. If minds are wholly dependent on brains, and brains on biochemistry, and biochemistry in the long run on the meaningless flux of atoms, I cannot understand how the thought of those minds should have any more significance than the sound of the wind in the trees, or the sound of the tree falling where no one is to hear it. And this is to me the final test. This is how I distinguish dreaming from waking. When I am awake, I can, in some degree, account for my study, the study of my dream. The dragon that pursued me last night can fit into my waking world. I know that there are such things as dreams. I know that I had eaten an indigestible dinner. I know that a man of my reading might be expected to dream of dragons. But while in the nightmare I could not have fitted in my waking experience. The waking world is judged more real because it can thus contain the dreaming world. The dreaming world is judged less real because it cannot contain the waking one. For the same reason I am certain that in passing from the scientific point of view to the theological, I have passed from dreaming to waking. And this is why Peterson keeps talking about theological when he gets to this point in the conversation, because we're using theological language now. Christian theology can fit in science, art, morality, and the sub-Christian religions. The scientific point of view cannot fit in any of these things. Not even science itself. I believe in Christianity as I believe in the sun, S-U-N. I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because I see everything, but because by it I see everything else. Back to miracles. It is of some importance here to make sure that if vaguely spatial imaginary intrudes, and in many minds it certainly will, it should not be of the wrong kind. We had better not envision our acts of reason as something above or behind or beyond nature. Rather, this side of nature. In other words, when we do our monarchical vision of science, it's still our vision. It's on this side of nature. It's not really above it because we keep getting it wrong. It is by inference that we build up the idea of nature at all. Reason is given before nature, and on reason our concept of nature depends. Our acts of inference are prior to our picture of nature, almost as the telephone is prior to the friend's voice that we hear by it. When we try to fit these acts into the picture of nature, we fail. The item which we put into that picture and label reason always turns out to be something different from the reason we ourselves are enjoying and exercising while we put it in. The description we have to give of thought as an evolutionary phenomenon always makes a tacit exception in favor of thinking, which we ourselves perform at that moment. In other words, this is the exception that, all y'all believe in religion or not religion because how you're raised. Me, I see clearly, and I've decided for myself. Oh, you've decided. We'll talk to the folks in the Berkshires. I can decide. Everyone else is a moist robot. For the one can only, like any particular feat, exhibit at a particular moments in particular consciousness the general and for the most part non-rational working of the whole interlocked system. The other, our present act, claims and must claim to be the act of insight, a knowledge sufficiently free from our non-rational causation to be determined positively only by the truth it knows. This is how we might actually know truth. But in the imagined thinking which we put into the picture depends, because our whole idea of truth of nature depends on the thinking we are actually doing, not vice versa. This is the prime reality on which the attribution of reality to anything else rests. If it won't fit into nature, we can't help it. We will certainly not on that account give it up. If we do, we should be giving up nature too. In other words, this is the reason all those guys left the Berkshires and loved their wives and cared about their children and did their best to stay awake as they drove or went on airplanes. So, that's chapter 3. Let me know what you think. I'm out of time.